He thought his power made him untouchable. In front of his guests, Victor humiliated a humble waiter, Gabriel, without a second thought. But what Victor didn't know was that the man he scorned would rise to build a legacy that would shake the very foundation of his empire. Before we start the story, comment below which city you are watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Victor leaned against the glass railing of his penthouse balcony, the city sprawling out below him in glittering patterns of light. From this height, the world looked orderly, every building and street precisely where it belonged. It was a view that suited Victor, a man who valued control, precision, and above all, success. With a crystal tumbler of scotch in hand, he surveyed the skyline, his thoughts lingering on his latest triumph. His restaurant chain had just expanded into another city, cementing his reputation as a culinary mogul. Journalists praised him as a visionary, investors courted him as a sure bet. He basked in it all, knowing every accolade was deserved. Victor thrived on his image. His tailored suits, the sharp glint of his gold watch, and the sleek design of his penthouse were more than luxuries. They were symbols of his dominance. The world respected power, and Victor had spent his life mastering how to wield it. He took a slow sip of scotch, savouring the burn. His empire was untouchable. At least that's what he told himself. Across the city, in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and a perpetually leaky faucet, Gabriel sat at a small kitchen table, his head bent over a battered notebook. The dim overhead light flickered, but he paid it no mind. The pages before him were filled with careful sketches, restaurant layouts, menus, and to-do lists that mapped out the dream he had carried in his heart for years. Gabriel's hands were calloused from long shifts waiting tables, and his shoulders ached from carrying trays of food night after night. But none of that mattered when he was lost in his plans. In this moment, he wasn't just a waiter scraping by. He was a man with a vision. From the next room, he heard the soft sounds of his wife, Maria, putting their daughter to bed. Her voice carried the same warmth that had drawn him to her years ago, even though life had worn her down in ways that made Gabriel's chest ache. They had always dreamed of something better, but dreams didn't pay the bills. Gabriel knew that too well. He stared down at the notebook, his pen hovering over a half-finished drawing of a cozy dining space. It was supposed to be a restaurant where people felt welcome and connected, where food brought people together in a way he'd always believed it could. But the realities of rent, loans, and his meagre savings weighed on him, making the dream feel distant, unreachable. The sound of Maria's voice faded as she joined him in the kitchen, her hair tied back and her face weary but kind. She set a cup of tea in front of him and pulled out the chair beside him. "Still working on the plans?" she asked, glancing at the open notebook. Gabriel nodded, his lips pressing into a tight line. "I have to believe it's possible," he said quietly. "If I don't, what's the point?" Maria reached over, placing her hand over his. "It is possible," she said, her voice steady. "You just have to find the right moment." Gabriel wanted to believe her, but as he looked around their tiny kitchen, the weight of reality felt crushing. Bills stacked on the counter, the flickering light, and the faint smell of mildew reminded him of how far they still had to go. That night, two men lay awake in opposite corners of the city. Victor, in the silence of his pristine bedroom, thought only of expansion. His latest acquisition wasn't enough. He wanted more restaurants, more power, more proof that he was untouchable. Anything less felt like failure. Gabriel, on a thin mattress in the cramped bedroom he shared with Maria, stared at the ceiling. His thoughts were consumed by the gap between his dreams and his reality. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a spark of determination refused to die. Neither man knew it yet, but their paths were about to collide in a way that would change both of their lives forever. The dining hall of Victor's flagship restaurant was nothing short of spectacular. Crystal chandeliers glittered like stars overhead, casting warm light across the room's polished marble floors. Each table was draped in pristine white linens and adorned with centerpieces of fresh orchids. The scent of fine cuisine mingled with the low hum of conversation as waiters moved gracefully between the tables, their trays balanced with champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. Tonight's event was a celebration of Victor's latest success, the expansion of his restaurant chain into a major international market. The city's elite had gathered to toast the man of the hour, and Victor stood at the center of it all, his tailored suit sharp and his smile sharper. "To Victor," one of the guests toasted, raising a glass, "the king of fine dining." Victor smirked, raising his own glass. "Thank you, but tonight isn't just about me," he said smoothly, his voice carrying over the room. "It's about the vision, the dedication, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. That's what sets us apart." The crowd erupted into polite applause. Victor thrived in moments like these. He scanned the room, basking in the admiration of his peers. This was his domain, and he ruled it with unwavering confidence. Gabriel, dressed in the crisp black and white uniform of the waitstaff, moved silently through the crowd. His tray was heavy with champagne glasses, but his steps were steady. Years of experience had taught him how to navigate these glittering events without being noticed. But tonight, Gabriel felt the weight of more than just the tray. His thoughts wandered to his family back home, the rent payment looming over them, his daughter's wistful questions about why he always worked so late. He forced the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. Tonight's paycheck would help, if only for a little while. As Gabriel approached Victor's table, he caught sight of his employer out of the corner of his eye. Victor was laughing, surrounded by a circle of guests who hung on his every word. Gabriel had seen that laugh before, sharp, calculating, always at someone else's expense. "Focus," he whispered to himself. He tightened his grip on the tray and took another step forward. It happened in an instant. Gabriel's foot caught the edge of a thick rug that had shifted slightly beneath the table. The tray wobbled, and before he could regain his balance, a glass of red wine tipped, arcing through the air before landing squarely on the pristine white tablecloth in front of Victor. The room went silent. The murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses, all of it stopped as every eye turned toward Victor's table. Gabriel froze, his heart pounding as he stared at the spreading stain of crimson against the white fabric. Victor's smile faded. Slowly, deliberately, he stood, his movements precise and controlled. He tapped his champagne flute with a spoon, the soft chime cutting through the silence like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor began, his voice calm but cold. "Let's take a moment to reflect on this unfortunate incident." Gabriel's stomach sank. He could feel the heat rising to his face as Victor's gaze swept over him, sharp and unforgiving. "This," Victor said, gesturing to the tablecloth, "is what happens when people lack focus, when they fail to pay attention to detail. In my world, there's no room for mistakes like this. Excellence demands discipline." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Gabriel's fists tightened around the tray. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. He needed this job too much to risk speaking out. Victor's voice rose again, dripping with condescension. "Some people," he continued, his eyes flicking briefly toward Gabriel, "are destined to remain where they are. And that's fine. The world needs its workers too." The laughter grew louder, spreading like wildfire. Gabriel's chest tightened as he lowered his gaze to the floor. He bent down, grabbing a cloth from his apron to clean the mess, his hands trembling as the weight of humiliation pressed down on him. Victor waved a dismissive hand. "Clean it up," he said, already turning back to his guests. "Now, where were we?" As the conversation resumed around him, Gabriel worked silently, the laughter and whispered comments searing themselves into his memory. When he finished cleaning the table, he stepped away quickly, retreating to the kitchen where the other staff avoided meeting his eyes. Later that night, As Gabriel walked home through the quiet streets, the scene replayed in his mind over and over. Victor's words, the laughter, the stares, it all burned. His fists clenched at his sides, his steps quickening as he tried to outrun the shame. By the time he reached his apartment, his anger had transformed into something else: resolve. Gabriel sat down at the kitchen table, pulling out his battered notebook. He stared at the pages filled with sketches and plans, the faint lines of erasure marking where he had once doubted himself. "This isn't the end," he muttered under his breath, gripping the edge of the notebook tightly. "Not for me." That night, Gabriel didn't just dream of his restaurant. He decided he would make it a reality, no matter what it took. Gabriel woke to the soft sound of his daughter giggling in the next room. The first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains, bathing the small apartment in a pale glow. He blinked, momentarily disoriented, until the events of the previous night crashed down on him. Victor's words, the laughter of the crowd, and the knot of humiliation in his chest. It all came rushing back. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type treasure if you've made it this far. Only those who get this far will understand. Now, let's get back to the story. He glanced at the notebook still open on the kitchen table. The page he'd scribbled on was a chaotic mix of thoughts, fragments of menu ideas, sketches of a potential floor plan, and hastily scrawled reminders. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Maria appeared in the doorway, her hair pulled back and her face still marked by the faint lines of sleep. She smiled softly when she saw him. "You were up late," she said, crossing the room to pour herself a cup of coffee. Gabriel nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "I couldn't stop thinking." "About last night?" Maria asked, sitting down across from him. "About everything," he admitted. "Victor, the job. This." He gestured to the notebook. "It's not enough anymore, Maria. I can't keep working like this, being treated like I don't matter. I want more. For us." Maria reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You've always wanted more," she said gently. "But wanting isn't enough. What are you going to do?" Gabriel stared at the notebook for a long moment. "I'm going to quit," he said finally. The words felt heavy, but once they were out, they carried a strange sense of relief. Maria blinked, surprised, but her expression softened into something like pride. "Then quit," she said. "But don't just quit, Gabriel. Move forward. Make this," she tapped the notebook, "real." Her confidence bolstered him in a way he hadn't expected. Gabriel felt the knot of fear in his chest loosen just enough for hope to slip in. That afternoon, Gabriel returned to the restaurant. The air was thick with the smell of cleaning supplies as the staff prepared for another evening of high-end dining. The memory of the previous night was still fresh, and Gabriel could feel the weight of the other employees' stares as he walked through the kitchen. "Gabriel!" his manager called from his office, waving him over. "Come here for a second." Gabriel stepped inside, his heart pounding. The manager leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Listen, about last night," he began, his tone measured. "Victor can be harsh, but you handled it well. We need people like you who can take the heat." Gabriel hesitated for a moment, the words of praise doing little to soothe the simmering frustration beneath his surface. He took a deep breath, then pulled a neatly folded envelope from his pocket and set it on the desk. "What's this?" the manager asked, frowning as he reached for it. "My resignation," Gabriel said simply. The manager froze, staring at the envelope as though it were a bomb. "You're quitting?" he asked, incredulous. "Gabriel, you're one of our best. Are you sure about this?" Gabriel nodded, his resolve firm. "I've thought about it a lot. It's time for me to move on." The manager sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "This industry's tough. You sure you're ready for what's out there?" "I know it's tough," Gabriel replied. "But I also know I'm ready." The manager stared at him for a moment longer before nodding reluctantly. Well, if you ever need a reference, you know where to find me. Gabriel thanked him, then turned and walked out of the office. Each step toward the door felt lighter, freer, as though he were shedding years of weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. By the time Gabriel reached home that evening, the excitement of his decision was mingled with the first pangs of doubt. The future loomed ahead, vast and uncertain. But he knew there was no turning back. Maria was waiting for him in the living room, her face lighting up when she saw the determination in his eyes. "You did it," she said, her voice brimming with pride. "I did," Gabriel replied, pulling her into a hug. "Now comes the hard part." Maria laughed softly. "You've never been afraid of hard work." Together they sat down at the kitchen table and opened the notebook. The sketches and plans that had once felt like distant dreams now seemed tangible, ready to be shaped into something real. They spent hours poring over the details, mapping out budgets and brainstorming ideas. Maria's practical mind balanced Gabriel's creative vision, and by the end of the night, they had a plan. Rough but promising. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Gabriel scoured the city for a space to lease, meeting with landlords and walking through properties that ranged from cramped to derelict. Every setback only fueled his determination. When he finally found a small corner location on a quiet street, his heart leapt. The storefront was dusty and neglected, but Gabriel could see its potential. The landlord, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, eyed Gabriel skeptically as he handed over the lease. "This your first restaurant?" he asked. Gabriel nodded. "It is." The landlord smirked. "You're brave. This business eats people alive." Gabriel smiled faintly. "I know, but I'm ready." That night, as Gabriel stood in the empty space that would become his restaurant, he felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The walls were scuffed, the floors uneven, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. But Gabriel didn't see the flaws. He saw the future. Maria joined him, holding their daughter's hand. "It's perfect," she said, her voice steady. Gabriel nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and determination. "It's a start," he said. "And it's ours." Victor sat in his expansive corner office, surrounded by glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the city he once commanded. The skyline gleamed in the afternoon light, but for the first time, it didn't fill him with his usual sense of pride. Instead, it felt distant, like the world was slowly moving away from him. On his desk lay a quarterly financial report, the numbers printed in sharp black ink. Revenue was plummeting, expenses were ballooning, and the warning signs of an empire in decline were unmistakable. Victor stared at the paper, his jaw tight. He refused to believe it. "This can't be right," he said, his voice low but sharp. Across the desk, his finance director shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The man, usually calm and precise, now looked as though he wanted to melt into the leather. "I've double-checked the numbers, sir," he said carefully. "The trends are clear. We've been losing key staff at multiple locations, which has affected service quality. Complaints are up and reservations are down, and—" He hesitated, glancing at the papers in his lap. "The press hasn't been kind lately." Victor frowned, leaning forward. "The press? What press?" The director cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "There was an interview. A former employee went public about the working conditions in your restaurants. It's gone viral on social media, and more employees have come forward to share similar stories. Customers are starting to notice." Victor waved a dismissive hand, scoffing. "Social media? That's all this is about. Some disgruntled employees whining to an audience that'll forget about them in a week." The director hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. "With respect, sir, the narrative is sticking, and investors, they're worried." Victor's expression darkened. "Let them worry. I'll handle this." The director nodded meekly, gathered his papers, and left the office. Victor remained seated, staring out at the city. He didn't like the feeling creeping into his chest, something uncomfortably close to doubt. The first major blow came just a week later. Victor's flagship restaurant, the jewel of his empire, was forced to shut its doors temporarily. A wave of resignations had left it understaffed, and the few remaining employees struggled to meet the demands of high-end dining. Customers were furious, their cancelled reservations sparking a firestorm of negative reviews online. Victor sat in a meeting with his operations team, his temper simmering just beneath the surface. "How did this happen?" he demanded, slamming his hand on the table. "How does the best restaurant in the city fall apart overnight?" "Sir," one of the managers began nervously, "the staff turnover has been an issue for months. The work environment is fine," Victor snapped. "They're being paid, aren't they? What more do they want?" The manager hesitated. "Respect," she said quietly, "and a leader who listens." The room fell silent. Victor's gaze locked on her, his jaw tightening. "Are you suggesting I'm the problem?" The manager flinched, then quickly shook her head. "No, sir. I'm just saying the industry is changing. People want to work in places where they feel valued. If we don't adapt—" "Enough," Victor said sharply, cutting her off. "Find replacements. Offer bonuses if you have to. But fix this. Now." The meeting ended in uneasy silence. Victor stormed back to his office, but the anger that burned in his chest wasn't directed at his team. It was directed at himself. Deep down, he knew the cracks in his empire were more than surface level. The second blow came when one of Victor's largest investors pulled out, citing philosophical differences in a carefully worded statement. Their withdrawal sent shockwaves through Victor's network, and within days, 2 more investors followed suit. The financial stability of his company, once rock solid, was now on shaky ground. Victor was forced to sell off one of his smaller restaurants to cover mounting debts. Sitting in his office late at night, he stared at the foreclosure notice for another location. The words blurred as he read them over and over, his mind racing with strategies that no longer seemed viable. He poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid reflecting the dim light of the room. For the first time, Victor felt something he couldn't ignore, the weight of failure pressing down on him. Meanwhile, the stories of Victor's mismanagement continued to spread. Former employees took to social media to share their experiences, painting a damning picture of an empire built on fear and exploitation. Customers began boycotting his restaurants, their loyalty eroded by the flood of negative publicity. In contrast, whispers of a new restaurant began circulating through the city. Gabriel's Table, they called it. A humble establishment that was quickly becoming the talk of the town. Customers praised its innovative menu, its welcoming atmosphere, and its compassionate leadership. Victor heard the name for the first time during a meeting with his marketing team. "Have you seen this?" one of them asked, sliding a newspaper across the table. The headline read, "A new standard. How Gabriel's Table is redefining fine dining." Victor stared at the name, his mind racing. "Gabriel," he muttered under his breath. He thought back to the waiter he had humiliated at his party, the man who had disappeared shortly afterward. It couldn't be the same Gabriel, could it? But the more he read, the clearer it became. It was him. The man Victor had dismissed as a failure was now being hailed as a visionary. Victor clenched his fists, his chest tightening with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The article described Gabriel as everything Victor wasn't: humble, respectful, and driven by a genuine love for the craft. For the first time in his career, Victor felt something he had never allowed himself to feel: fear. His empire was crumbling, and the man he had underestimated was rising to take his place. Gabriel stood in the center of the small, dimly lit space that would become Gabriel's Table. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the cracked windows, and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the air. The walls were scuffed, the floors uneven, and the ceiling tiles sagged in places. To most, it might have seemed hopeless, but to Gabriel, it was perfect. His notebook was tucked under his arm, the pages filled with plans and ideas. He could already see it. Warm lighting casting a cozy glow, tables arranged for intimacy and connection, and a menu that spoke not just of flavour, but of heart. Maria entered the space, their daughter holding her hand. She glanced around, her brow furrowing slightly. "It needs work," she said honestly, her tone cautious. Gabriel laughed, a spark of excitement in his chest. "It needs everything," he admitted. "But it's ours." Maria's expression softened as she saw the light in his eyes. "Then we'll make it work." The first weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Gabriel and Maria spent every spare moment in the space, transforming it piece by piece. Friends and family came to help, some offering labour, others donating materials. A local carpenter crafted simple but sturdy tables and chairs, and Maria found second-hand decor that added charm without breaking their budget. Gabriel worked harder than he ever had, sanding floors, painting walls, and even rewiring light fixtures under the guidance of a kind but gruff electrician. Every improvement brought the space closer to the vision he'd carried for years. The menu was Gabriel's passion project. He spent late nights in their small kitchen at home, testing recipes and fine-tuning dishes. His goal wasn't to impress with extravagance, but to create meals that felt like a warm embrace, simple, flavorful, and deeply satisfying. As the opening day approached, the pressure mounted. Gabriel had poured his savings into the restaurant, and the loan he'd taken out left little room for error. Maria kept him grounded, reminding him of how far they'd come. "You've built something beautiful," she said one night, as they sat on the floor of the nearly finished dining room, exhaustion etched into their faces. "People will see that," Gabriel nodded, though doubt still gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had taken a leap of faith, but the fear of failure loomed large. When the big day arrived, Gabriel stood outside the freshly cleaned windows of Gabriel's table, watching as a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk. The sign above the door was simple, yet elegant, its bold letters a quiet declaration of his dream made real. The butterflies in his stomach threatened to overwhelm him, but Maria's reassuring hand on his shoulder grounded him. "You're ready," she said softly. "Go show them." With a deep breath, Gabriel opened the door and welcomed the first customers inside. The dining room filled quickly, the hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware replacing the silence that had once haunted the space. Gabriel moved from table to table, introducing himself and listening intently to feedback. He worked alongside his small team, bussing tables, plating dishes, and ensuring every guest felt cared for. The response was overwhelming. Diners raved about the food, dishes that were both familiar and innovative, made with fresh, local ingredients. But what stood out most was the atmosphere. People described the space as welcoming, intimate, and genuine, a reflection of Gabriel himself. By the time the last guests left, Gabriel stood in the middle of the empty dining room, his apron stained and his legs aching. Maria walked in from the kitchen, holding a bottle of champagne. "To Gabriel's table," she said, handing him a glass. Gabriel smiled as he raised his glass. "To us," he replied. They clinked their glasses together, the sound echoing softly in the quiet space. For the first time in years, Gabriel felt a deep sense of pride. His dream was no longer just a vision, it was real. The weeks that followed cemented Gabriel's table as a rising star in the city's culinary scene. Word spread quickly, and soon customers were lining up for reservations. Food critics praised the menu's simplicity and heart, while guests shared their experiences on social media, calling the restaurant a place where food felt like home. Gabriel's leadership style became a beacon in the industry. Former employees of larger chains began seeking him out, drawn by stories of his kindness and respect. Gabriel welcomed them, building a team that shared his values and worked together like a family. Despite the restaurant's success, Gabriel remained humble. He spent as much time in the kitchen as he did in the dining room, ensuring every dish met his standards. He made it a point to greet each guest personally, learning their names and listening to their stories. Gabriel's table wasn't just a restaurant, it was a community. One evening, as Gabriel locked up for the night, Maria handed him a newspaper. The headline read, "A New Standard, How Gabriel's Table is Changing the Restaurant Industry." A photo of the dining room accompanied the article, along with a glowing review. "You did it," Maria said, her voice filled with pride. Gabriel shook his head, a small smile on his lips. "We did it." Maria leaned against him, her voice soft. "So, what's next?" Gabriel looked out at the quiet street, the sign for Gabriel's table glowing softly in the darkness. "We keep going," he said. "We keep building." Across the city, Victor sat in his darkened apartment, scrolling through an article on his phone. His jaw tightened as he read the name Gabriel again and again. The man he had once dismissed as insignificant was now being hailed as a visionary, while Victor's empire crumbled around him. Victor tossed the phone onto the table, his chest tightening. The words on the screen felt like a taunt, a new era in dining, led by compassion and creativity. For the first time in his life, Victor wondered if he had been wrong. The night air carried the faint scent of rain as Victor stepped out of his car. The glow of Gabriel's table lit the quiet corner of the street, its warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. Victor hesitated, his hand gripping the car door. He had stared at the glowing sign countless times over the past week, debating whether he had the courage to step inside. Tonight, something had finally pushed him forward. Curiosity, regret, or perhaps a desperate need for validation. He wasn't sure which. Let's have some fun with the readers in the comments. Type water if you've made it this far. Now, let's get back to the story. With a deep breath, he closed the car door and walked toward the entrance. The soft hum of conversation and the faint clinking of dishes greeted him as he stepped through the glass doors. The restaurant was alive with energy, its cozy dining room filled with diners who leaned toward each other over candlelit tables, their faces lit with warmth and laughter. Victor scanned the room, taking in the soft glow of the lights, the simple yet elegant decor, and the faint scent of herbs and freshly baked bread that lingered in the air. There was a genuine intimacy here, a sense of community he had never been able to replicate in his own restaurants. It stirred something unfamiliar in him, something uncomfortably close to envy. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" a server asked, her tone polite but firm. Victor hesitated. "I'm here to see Gabriel." The server nodded, gesturing toward the kitchen pass at the far end of the dining room. Victor's eyes followed her direction, and there he was. Gabriel, standing in a white chef's coat, his sleeves rolled up as he spoke to a member of his team. His movements were deliberate, confident, yet unassuming. The soft lines of a man who had worked hard for everything he had earned were etched into his face. Gabriel glanced up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Surprise flickered across his face, but he quickly composed himself. Handing off a plated dish to a server, Gabriel made his way toward Victor. "Victor," Gabriel said, his voice steady but measured, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Victor shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how out of place he felt. The words he had rehearsed on the drive over seemed to evaporate. "I wanted to see the place," he said finally. "Your restaurant?" Gabriel nodded, gesturing to a quieter corner near the bar. "Let's talk." They sat across from each other at a small table, the hum of the restaurant fading slightly in the background. Gabriel folded his hands in front of him, his expression calm but unreadable. Victor fidgeted with his watch, an old habit he hadn't noticed in years. "This is impressive," Victor said, gesturing vaguely toward the room. "The atmosphere, the energy. You've built something special here." "Thank you," Gabriel replied evenly. "It's taken a lot of work." Victor nodded, swallowing hard. "I know what that's like. Or at least, I thought I did." Gabriel tilted his head slightly, waiting. Victor hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I came here tonight to say I was wrong. About you. About everything. Gabriel didn't flinch, his expression remaining steady. Victor continued, his words slow and deliberate. I treated you unfairly. I humiliated you in front of my guests, my staff. I thought it made me stronger to put others down, but it didn't. It just made me smaller. Gabriel's eyes softened, though his tone remained firm. Why now, Victor? Why come here after all this time? Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because I've lost everything. My restaurants, my reputation. It's all gone. And seeing you here, succeeding, it's made me realize how blind I was. I thought power meant being feared, being in control. But now I see what it really looks like. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, studying Victor carefully. And what does it look like? Victor gestured to the dining room. It looks like this. Like people who respect you, who want to work for you. Not because they're afraid, but because they believe in what you're doing. Gabriel let the words linger for a moment before replying. Life has a way of humbling us, he said quietly. The question is, what do you do with that humility? Victor nodded, his throat tightening. I want to change. I don't know if I can fix what I've broken, but I want to try. Gabriel leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Change isn't about what you say, Victor. It's about what you do. Start by taking responsibility for the people you've hurt, for the choices you've made. If you're serious about being better, you'll show it. Victor looked down, the weight of Gabriel's words pressing on him. Thank you, he said softly, for listening, for not throwing me out the moment I walked in. Gabriel offered a small, genuine smile. Everyone deserves a second chance. What matters is what you do with it. As Victor stepped out into the cool night air, the glow of Gabriel's table felt warmer now, less like a spotlight and more like a beacon. For the first time in years, he felt something beyond regret, something that resembled hope. Inside, Gabriel returned to the kitchen, his mind lingering on the conversation. He didn't know if Victor would truly change, but he had done his part. Forgiveness, he reminded himself, wasn't about absolving others. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of the past. And for Gabriel, the future was just beginning. Victor sat at a small table in a quiet cafe, a notebook open in front of him. The pages were blank, save for a single word scrawled across the top: purpose. He stared at it, the weight of its meaning pressing down on him. For years, his purpose had been singular: to dominate the restaurant industry. Success, to Victor, had been measured in profits and accolades, but now those metrics felt hollow. The faint clatter of cups and the low hum of conversation filled the cafe. It was a far cry from the lavish offices he had once commanded, but Victor had come to appreciate the simplicity. Here, no one knew his name or his past. He was just another man trying to figure out what came next. He picked up his pen and began to write. Across town, Gabriel's table was bustling. The dining room hummed with life, as customers enjoyed the kind of meal that lingered in the memory long after the last bite. Gabriel moved seamlessly between the kitchen and the dining area, checking in with staff and greeting familiar faces. His expansion plans were well underway. 2 additional locations were set to open in the coming months, each one designed to carry the same warmth and integrity that had made the original so beloved. But success came with its own challenges. Gabriel found himself navigating new responsibilities, hiring and training staff, managing budgets, and ensuring his team stayed aligned with the restaurant's core values. The pressure was constant, but Gabriel thrived on it. He had built something that mattered, and he wasn't about to let it falter. One afternoon, as Gabriel was reviewing blueprints for the new location, Maria walked into the office, a thoughtful expression on her face. She placed a folded piece of paper on his desk. "What's this?" Gabriel asked, setting the blueprints aside. "It's a letter," Maria said. "From Victor." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "Victor, What does he want? I don't know, Maria replied, sitting across from him. But he sounds different, humble. Gabriel unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. Victor's tone was measured, almost apologetic. He thanked Gabriel for their conversation and shared his plans to start teaching at a local culinary school. He spoke of his desire to give back, to use his experience to guide others in the industry. He's trying, Gabriel murmured, more to himself than to Maria. Do you believe him? Maria asked. Gabriel set the letter down, his expression thoughtful. I think he's sincere. But change takes time. Maria nodded. It's a start. Victor's journey toward redemption was slow and unsteady, but he embraced it with a determination he hadn't felt in years. He began teaching at a culinary school that catered to underprivileged students, sharing the skills he had once used to build his empire. At first, the students were skeptical, their guarded expressions mirroring his own unease. But as Victor shared his knowledge, peppered with stories of his own failures and hard-learned lessons, he saw their walls begin to crumble. One student, a young woman named Eleanor, stayed behind after class one day. Chef Victor, she said hesitantly, why do you do this? I mean, you used to be famous. Why teach here? Victor hesitated, his gaze dropping to the worn countertop in front of him. Because fame doesn't mean anything if you've lost yourself in the process, he said finally. I spent years chasing the wrong kind of success. Now, I want to help others find the right kind. Elena nodded, her expression softening. You're good at it, she said quietly. Teaching, I mean. Victor felt a faint smile tug at his lips. Thank you, he said, the words carrying more weight than she could have known. Months passed, and Victor's efforts began to ripple outward. He reached out to former employees, offering apologies, and in some cases, opportunities to reconnect. Some accepted his overtures while others met him with understandable skepticism. Victor didn't push. He understood that forgiveness wasn't owed, it had to be earned. Meanwhile, Gabriel continued to thrive. His second location opened to critical acclaim, and plans for a third were already underway. Despite the growing demands on his time, Gabriel made it a point to stay connected to his team. He remembered what it felt like to be overlooked, and he vowed never to let his employees feel the same. One evening, as Gabriel locked up the original Gabriel's table, he noticed a familiar figure standing across the street. Victor was dressed simply, his hands in his pockets as he watched the restaurant from a distance. Gabriel stepped outside, crossing the street to greet him. Victor, he said, his tone neutral, but not unkind. What brings you here? Victor smiled faintly. I wanted to see how things are going, he said. You've done something incredible here. Gabriel studied him for a moment, noting the changes in his demeanor. There was a quietness to Victor now, a humility that hadn't been there before. Thank you, Gabriel said. It's been a journey. Victor nodded, his gaze lingering on the glowing sign above the door. I've started my own journey, he said. It's not easy, but it's meaningful. Gabriel extended a hand, and Victor shook it firmly. That's what matters, Gabriel said. Keep at it. As Victor walked away, Gabriel returned to the restaurant, his mind turning over their conversation. He didn't know what the future held for Victor, but he hoped the man would find what he was looking for. After all, everyone deserved a second chance. Gabriel stood in the bustling kitchen of his second restaurant, the air thick with the savoury scent of searing meats and the sharp tang of freshly chopped herbs. The hum of activity filled the space, chefs calling out orders, knives chopping against cutting boards, and the occasional burst of steam from a busy stovetop. It was organised chaos, the kind Gabriel thrived on. But today, something felt different. Maria appeared at the pass, a clipboard in hand, and a concerned expression on her face. We need to talk, she said, gesturing toward the office. Gabriel wiped his hands on his apron and followed her, weaving through the crowded kitchen. Once inside the small office, Maria shut the door behind them and placed the clipboard on the desk. "What's going on?" Gabriel asked, his brow furrowed. Maria tapped the clipboard. "We've had a few cancellations, regulars, and I've been hearing whispers from customers about a new restaurant opening downtown." Gabriel frowned, picking up the clipboard and scanning the reservation log. "A new restaurant?" Maria nodded. "It's called Ambrosia. They're targeting the same clientele as us, fine dining, but with a modern twist, and their marketing is aggressive." Gabriel set the clipboard down, his mind racing. Competition was nothing new, but this felt different. Gabriel's table had built its reputation on authenticity, community, and integrity. Could this new player threaten that foundation? Across town, Victor sat in his apartment, scrolling through an article on his phone. The headline read, "Ambrosia, the future of fine dining." He read the glowing review with a mixture of intrigue and unease. The restaurant's founder, an ambitious chef named Lila Moreau, had a reputation for cutting corners and prioritizing profits over principles. Victor's stomach churned. He recognized Lila's tactics. They were uncomfortably familiar. She had once been a rising star in his own network, and her methods had always been ruthless. Now, it seemed, she was aiming to dominate the same market Gabriel had worked so hard to create. Victor closed the article and leaned back in his chair, his thoughts turning to Gabriel. For the first time, he wondered if he could help. A week later, Gabriel sat in the original Gabriel's table, his notebook open on the table in front of him. The competition from Ambrosia was intensifying. Ads for the new restaurant seemed to be everywhere. Social media, billboards, even local radio. Customers were curious, and some had already made the switch, lured by promises of an elevated dining experience. Maria sat across from him, her expression worried. "We need to respond," she said. "We can't just ignore this." Gabriel nodded slowly. "But how? We've never been about flashy marketing. Our reputation has always spoken for itself." "Sometimes reputation isn't enough," Maria said gently. "We need to remind people why they fell in love with this place." Meanwhile, Victor found himself at the culinary school, teaching a class on restaurant management. His usual lesson plan fell to the side as his thoughts kept circling back to Gabriel. Finally, after dismissing the class, Victor made a decision. That evening, he arrived at Gabriel's table. The staff greeted him politely, and a server quickly informed Gabriel, who came out from the kitchen, looking surprised. "Victor," Gabriel said, wiping his hands on a towel. "What brings you here?" Victor hesitated, then gestured toward a nearby table. "Can we talk?" They sat down, and Victor wasted no time. "I've heard about Ambrosia," he said. "It's a threat, and I know the person behind it." Gabriel leaned back, crossing his arms. "Lila Moreau?" he said. "You worked with her, didn't you?" Victor nodded. "She used to be part of my network. She's smart, ambitious, and willing to do whatever it takes to win. I'm here because I want to help." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "Help? Why?" Victor exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I know what it feels like to have someone come after everything you've built. And because I respect what you've done here." Gabriel studied Victor for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly are you offering?" "Advice," Victor said simply. "I know Lila's tactics. I can help you anticipate her moves." Gabriel leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "You think I should fight fire with fire?" "No," Victor said firmly. "You're better than that, but you can't ignore her either. You have to be strategic. Remind people what makes your restaurant special." Gabriel considered this, then nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll listen." Over the next few weeks, Gabriel and Victor worked together to navigate the growing competition. Victor's insights proved invaluable. He helped Gabriel refine his marketing strategy, focusing on community engagement and authenticity rather than flashy ads. Gabriel hosted events at his restaurants, inviting regulars and newcomers alike to experience the heart of Gabriel's table firsthand. Victor also shared his experiences with Gabriel's staff, offering mentorship and advice. Slowly, he began to rebuild his own sense of purpose, finding fulfillment in supporting others rather than seeking personal gain. The tide began to turn. While ambrosia continued to draw attention with its polished veneer, customers who valued connection and authenticity returned to Gabriel's table. The restaurants thrived, their foundation stronger than ever. One evening, after the final guests had left, Gabriel and Victor sat together in the empty dining room. A bottle of wine sat between them, the air heavy with the quiet satisfaction of hard work. "You've come a long way," Gabriel said, pouring them each a glass. Victor smiled faintly. "So have you." They clinked glasses, their paths finally converging not as competitors, but as allies. Together, they had weathered the storm and emerged stronger for it. The warm golden light of sunset bathed the dining room of the original Gabriel's table, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. Gabriel stood at the entrance, watching as the last few customers of the evening stepped outside, their laughter trailing into the quiet night. The restaurant was silent now, but the energy of the day still lingered, a hum of satisfaction that Gabriel had come to cherish. Maria approached him, her clipboard in hand and a tired but content smile on her face. "That's it for tonight," she said, flipping through the pages. "The numbers are solid, and the feedback's great." Gabriel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Good," he said softly. "But we can't get comfortable. There's still work to do." Maria laughed, nudging him playfully. "You'd think we were struggling, the way you talk. Gabriel, we're thriving." Gabriel's smile grew. "I know, but thriving doesn't mean we stop improving." In the months since ambrosia had tried to claim the spotlight, Gabriel's table had only strengthened its position in the city's culinary scene. The competition had forced Gabriel to innovate, but he had done so without sacrificing the values that had built his success. His decision to host community-focused events, like farm-to-table nights featuring local producers and cooking classes for aspiring chefs, had solidified his reputation not just as a restaurateur, but as a leader who cared about the people around him. His second and third locations were thriving as well, each one carefully crafted to maintain the intimacy and authenticity of the original. Gabriel made it a point to visit each restaurant regularly, meeting with staff, tasting dishes, and ensuring that the heart of the business remained intact. Victor, meanwhile, had found his own rhythm. Teaching at the culinary school had become more than a job. It was a calling. He spent his days mentoring young chefs, many of whom came from difficult backgrounds, and his evenings consulting for small businesses looking to find their footing in the industry. One of his proudest moments came when one of his students, Eleanor, opened her own cafe. Victor had guided her through every step, from crafting the menu to negotiating with vendors. Seeing her smile on the day of the grand opening had filled Victor with a pride he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as Victor wrapped up a meeting with a local restaurant owner, his phone buzzed with a message from Gabriel. It was a short note, inviting him to a private event at the original Gabriel's table. Victor hesitated for a moment, then smiled. Gabriel rarely extended personal invitations, and the fact that he had meant something. The event was intimate, held after the restaurant's usual hours. Gabriel had invited a small group of friends, family, and trusted colleagues to celebrate the anniversary of the restaurant's opening. The dining room was warm and lively, filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. Victor arrived quietly, taking a moment to absorb the atmosphere before approaching Gabriel, who was standing near the bar. Gabriel turned, smiling when he saw Victor. "You made it," Gabriel said, extending a hand. Victor shook it firmly. "I wouldn't miss it. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type balloon if you've made it this far. Only those who made it will understand. Now, let's continue with the story." Gabriel gestured toward the room. "This is all because of them," he said. The staff, the customers, The people who believed in what we were building. Victor nodded, his gaze sweeping across the room. And because of you, he said. You've created something lasting, Gabriel. That's no small thing. Gabriel smiled, his eyes glinting with gratitude. It's a team effort, he said. But thank you. As the night wore on, Gabriel and Victor found themselves sitting at one of the corner tables, sharing a bottle of wine. Their conversation ranged from light-hearted banter to reflections on the paths that had brought them here. You've changed, Gabriel said at one point, his tone thoughtful. Victor chuckled. So have you. Gabriel raised his glass. To change then. Victor clinked his glass against Gabriel's. To growth. In the months that followed, both men continued to build their legacies in their own ways. Gabriel expanded his restaurants with care, never losing sight of the values that had made them successful. Victor, meanwhile, became a sought-after mentor in the culinary world, using his hard-earned wisdom to guide others. Though their paths rarely crossed, the respect between them remained. Each man had learned something valuable from the other. Gabriel had seen the importance of resilience and innovation, while Victor had discovered the power of humility and purpose. One evening, years later, Gabriel sat at the same kitchen table where his journey had begun. His daughter, now a teenager, sat across from him, flipping through the old notebook he had once filled with sketches and dreams. This is where it all started, she asked, her tone a mix of wonder and disbelief. Gabriel smiled, nodding. It is. Every restaurant, every idea. It all came from this. She looked up at him, her eyes bright. And now, look at everything you've built. Gabriel reached across the table, tapping the notebook. It's not just about what you build, he said. It's about how you build it, and who you bring along for the journey. Across town, Victor stood in front of a class of young chefs, his hands resting lightly on the counter. The thing about this business, he said, his voice steady, is that it's not just about food, it's about people, the connections you make, the lives you touch. That's what matters. A student raised her hand. Is that why you started teaching? Victor paused, then smiled. That's exactly why. The city buzzed with its usual energy, a symphony of car horns, distant chatter, and the hum of life. The kind of day that reminded Gabriel why he had fallen in love with its rhythm so many years ago. He stood outside the newest Gabriel's Table location, the sign above the entrance gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. This restaurant, the fifth in the chain, was his most ambitious yet, a testament to years of dedication, growth, and the belief that food could connect people in profound ways. Inside, the staff was preparing for opening night. The air was filled with the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven and the sharp, clean scent of freshly polished wood. Gabriel moved through the space, greeting staff and checking final details. His daughter, now a young adult, was by his side, taking notes on a tablet. Everything's looking great, she said, her tone brisk but excited. But we need to double-check the wine pairing list. Gabriel smiled, marveling at her efficiency. I'll leave that to you, he said. You've got a good eye for these things. She grinned. I learned from the best. As Gabriel watched her stride toward the wine rack, clipboard in hand, a wave of pride swept over him. She was part of his legacy now, not just in name, but in spirit. The restaurant had grown into something far greater than himself. It was a family, a community, and a symbol of what could be achieved with heart and integrity. Across town, Victor stood in front of a classroom filled with aspiring chefs. The walls were adorned with photographs of students who had graduated and gone on to open their own restaurants, their smiles a testament to Victor's mentorship. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed casually as he spoke. The biggest mistake I ever made, he said, his voice steady, was thinking that success was about power and money. It's not. Success is about the impact you have on the people around you, the lives you change. A hand shot up in the back of the room. Chef Victor, what made you realize that? Victor smiled faintly, his gaze distant for a moment. It wasn't just one thing, he admitted. But there was a time when I lost everything, and in rebuilding, I found something better. Purpose. The students nodded, their pens scratching across notebooks as they wrote down his words. Victor felt a deep satisfaction settle in his chest. Teaching had become his redemption, a way to turn his failures into something meaningful. One evening, months later, Gabriel hosted a charity event at the original Gabriel's table. The dining room was filled with familiar faces, staff, customers, and members of the community who had supported him over the years. The proceeds from the event would go toward funding culinary scholarships for underprivileged students, a cause close to Gabriel's heart. Victor was among the guests, sitting quietly at a corner table. He watched as Gabriel moved through the room, his presence commanding yet warm. When Gabriel finally approached, Victor stood and extended a hand. Gabriel, Victor said, his voice filled with genuine respect. This is incredible. Gabriel shook his hand, a smile spreading across his face. It's good to see you, Victor. They sat together, their conversation flowing easily. They spoke of their journeys, their challenges, and the unexpected paths their lives had taken. As the evening wore on, they found themselves reflecting on the moment that had first brought them together. You know, Victor said, swirling the wine in his glass, if you had told me back then that I'd be sitting here tonight, I wouldn't have believed you. Gabriel chuckled. Neither would I, but life has a way of surprising us. Victor raised his glass. To surprises then, and to growth. Gabriel clinked his glass against Victor's. To growth. As the night wound down, Gabriel stood at the entrance, watching as the last of the guests departed. The dining room was quiet now, but it still carried the warmth of the evening. He glanced back at Victor, who gave him a small nod before slipping out into the night. Maria appeared beside Gabriel, slipping her arm through his. It was a good night, she said softly. It was, Gabriel agreed. He looked out at the city, his heart full. And there's still so much more to do. What do you think about Gabriel's choice to forgive Victor? Was it a sign of strength, or would you have acted differently? Share your thoughts, because every story has more than one side. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to stay updated with all our stories. And check out more exciting ones by clicking here on the end screen.